In this section, I'd like to talk about setting up memory in Photoshop, because Photoshop is such a memory-intensive application that managing it becomes very critical, particularly when you're working with large color images. So the memory allocation section is in the Preferences, which in the Macintosh is underneath the Photoshop or Application menu, in Preferences, and in Windows is underneath the Edit menu. And you can just come down and choose Performance. It's not called Memory, it's called Performance. And it's a great title for it, because this really does, how you manage your memory really has a lot to do with how well Photoshop performs, how quickly it works. Now basically, there's three types of memory that Photoshop uses. The first is RAM, or Random Access Memory. And basically, you can think of RAM as being like your desktop workspace. The more RAM you have, the more workspace that you have to work on, and therefore the faster you can work, and or the more projects you can work on at one time. Now, Photoshop on both Mac and Windows uses dynamic allocation of memory. What that means is that Photoshop will take up only the amount of memory that it needs at any given moment. So that when you open up Photoshop, it's using a minimum amount of memory, but as soon as you open an image and start working on it, it'll take up more memory. For those of you who remember the Macintosh in System 9, you actually had to select an application when it wasn't running, do a Command-I, and then assign memory to it. Well, that's no longer true. The Macintosh is more now like Windows that has had dynamic application memory for quite a while. Photoshop will take up more and more memory. What this first dialog box portion shows you here is how much, on a percentage basis, of whatever RAM is currently available, Photoshop will have access to use. The number that you see here is in thousands of megabytes, also known as gigabytes. So this is 3072 megabytes or 3 gigabytes. And then Photoshop gives you like kind of an ideal range of what it would like to have access to use. So between 1689 and 2200, between 1500 and 2 gigabytes basically. So, and then this percentage of number right down here in megabytes is set at about 70% in this particular case. And notice that we're well between these two numbers. You want to have at least a bare bones minimum of 1 gigabyte of available RAM for Photoshop to use. And really, what you want to have for working on most images is 2 gigabytes of RAM for Photoshop to use. There's actually a complicated formula. There's a white paper on the Adobe website that describes in detail the complexities of how RAM is allocated in Photoshop. And you can read that if you want to, but when you get done with the end, you're going to come in here and assign 2 gigabytes of RAM. So that's really my recommendation. You want to have at least 1, but you really ought to have 2 gigabytes. So whatever amount of RAM it takes for you to have on your machine that allows you to assign at least 2 gigabytes of Photoshop, come in here and then adjust this so that you have at least 2 gigabytes available. But my strong recommendation is generally don't go above about 70 or 75%. Why? Because your operating system needs memory as well. And you never want your operating system in Photoshop to be running into each other and competing for the same RAM. So never assign anything more than about 75%, but have enough so that you can have at least 2 gigabytes of RAM for Photoshop to work with. And it's true, the larger the files that you work on, the more gigabytes of RAM that you're going to want to have. But if you have at least 2 gigabytes of RAM and you're working with 8 by 10, 300 pixel per inch images, you're going to have plenty of RAM assigned for Photoshop to use. The second level of memory that Photoshop uses is called history and cache. Now, if RAM is your desktop workspace that you have to work with, the cache is the portion of that RAM that is used at any given moment to recall the very latest thing that you did. That's what cache is. And then history state is storing the last X number of things that you've done somewhere in memory. How many history states you store depends upon this menu that you have here. The default is 20. If you're working on an image and applying edits to your image and you find that you need to step back more than what Photoshop is storing for you in the history states, you can come in here and assign more history states. And then Photoshop will store that. Now, Photoshop is going to use scratch disk space as well as RAM for managing the history states and the cache levels. So the more history states you have, the more cache levels you have. The higher the cache level, the more RAM and scratch disk space you want to have. We'll discuss scratch disk space in just a second. And that's fine. I mean, have as many history states as you need, but don't have any more than what you actually want to have or you need to have when you're working inside of your files on a regular basis. If you are working on a project that you know you're going to be doing lots of editing and have lots of variations of a file, then for that particular job, you may want to come in here and raise the number of history states. Once again, provide as much RAM as you possibly can. RAM is cheap. It's a lot cheaper than time that we have to spend waiting for Photoshop to perform things. Cache level actually does use a portion of RAM, and my suggestion is set the cache level up at 8. When you set your cache level up to 8, which is the maximum, Photoshop can store the maximum amount of information of the most recently used item, such as the last view or the last layer that you are working on. The only time you might want to lower the cache level is if you're using a Wacom pen tablet, and the pen tablet is acting a little slow or squirrely. Sometimes having a large cache level will interfere with that, so you might want to lower that if you have that problem with your pressure-sensitive tablet. And then finally, scratch disk levels. This is a critical memory variable to pay attention to. And first, what is scratch disk space? Well, if RAM is your desktop workspace, scratch disk is working in storage. It's working off of your hard drive. It's kind of like you've got your desktop table and then you've got your file cabinet, and your file cabinet is where you store things, but once in a while you need that extra space, so you work on top of your file cabinet as well. That's scratch disk. It's slower, it's kludgier, but it's an important aspect of memory to have because no matter how much RAM you have, Photoshop will indeed use scratch disk space in order to store various portions of your image or project that you're working on. How do we manage scratch disk space? Well, the best way to manage scratch disk is to have free and clear space for Photoshop to swap files back and forth from. And the easiest and the best way to do that is to have a separate volume that you don't store anything on. Best of all possible worlds is to have a separate hard drive installed internally in your desktop or tower computer, and then assign that as your scratch disk as you have here. By default, your computer will use the boot drive, which on a Windows machine is the C drive, and a Macintosh is the drive that comes up first in the upper right-hand corner of your desktop. In this case, it's the Macintosh HD. It will use that by default. And notice what I've done here is I've created a separate hard drive called Scratch, and you do this by reformatting your drive or putting in a separate drive, and that's the easiest thing to do. If you're working on a laptop and you can't have more than one drive, then you can reformat your drive and create a separate partition, a hardware partition to assign it to. Easiest thing, just put in a separate hard drive and just assign that as the scratch disk here. But just putting in the hard drive doesn't do it. You must come in here and check this checkbox and then click OK in the upper right-hand corner. And then in order to activate that new scratch disk, you'll have to quit Photoshop and then relaunch it. It won't access the new scratch disk until you actually quit Photoshop. There's the 3 portions of memory that you need to pay attention to. Just to review, at least 2 gigabytes of RAM for Photoshop to use. Never go above about 70 or 75% so that your operating system has plenty of RAM to work with. Your history states and cache. Cache uses a proportion of the RAM that you have for storing the most recently used item. Keep this at 8 as a general rule unless you're working with a pressure-sensitive tablet. Your history states, have as many history states as you need to work with, but no more than what you need to. Start with 20 and then go above if you need to. And finally, scratch disk, a separate volume that Photoshop can swap image data back and forth when free and clear and not run into any problems. There we go. So that's setting memory inside of Photoshop.